The night before our divorce was supposed to be quiet, final, almost merciful, but instead it became the moment everything shattered in a way I could never unsee. After nearly 6 months of sleeping in separate rooms, my husband quietly opened the bedroom door and slipped back into my bed. Like nothing had changed. Like we weren't already strangers, counting down the last hours of a 4-year marriage. My body tensed. The second, I felt the mattress dip under his weight. A reflex I didn't even realize I had developed. And in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains, I turned to him and whispered, "What are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, like he had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times, then said something so soft it almost sounded tender. "Just one last time." Those words should have felt like closure, like grief shared between two people who once loved each other deeply. But something about the way he said it made my chest tighten instead of soften. And then almost carelessly he placed his phone face up on the nightstand beside me. That small meaningless action changed everything. Because seconds later, the screen lit up. And before he could reach for it, before he could hide it, I saw the message that wasn't meant for me. Did she sign everything yet? In that instant, something inside me didn't just break it, rearranged. Every memory, every doubt, every quiet moment of distance over the past year suddenly shifted into a new horrifying clarity. He wasn't there because he missed me. He wasn't there because he loved me. He was there because he thought I was weak enough to be manipulated one last time before I signed away everything. I lay there frozen beside him, the man I had built my life around. The man who knew every fragile part of me. And I realized he was using those exact parts against me. The tenderness felt fake. The nostalgia felt staged. Even the timing felt calculated. And the worst part, a small humiliating part of me had almost believed him, almost let myself fall back into something that no longer existed. But that message exposed everything he didn't say out loud. It turned a quiet goodbye into something far more dangerous, a strategy. And in that moment I understood something I wish I had realized sooner. Betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it whispers, slips into your bed in the dark, and smiles like love, while it's planning your downfall. If you want to know what happened next, how that single message uncovered secrets far worse than I imagined, and how everything he tried to hide came crashing down, make sure you follow and stay with me, because this was only the beginning of a story that changed everything. I used to believe that marriages ended with noise, with slam doors shouting matches, or one unforgettable moment you could point to and say, "That's when everything fell apart." But I was wrong. Completely wrong. Because the truth is far more unsettling. Sometimes a marriage doesn't explode. It fades. It disappears so slowly, you don't even realize it's gone until you're standing in the ruins of something that once felt unbreakable. That's what happened to us. There was no single betrayal I could name at the beginning, no dramatic confession, no obvious turning point. Just silence. Long, heavy silence that crept into every corner of our lives. It started small, missed conversations over dinner texts that went unanswered, a little too long laughter that felt forced instead of natural. At first I told myself it was normal. People get busy. Life gets overwhelming. Relationships go through phases. But deep down, something felt off, like the emotional temperature in our home had dropped, and neither of us knew how to turn the heat back on. We stopped looking at each other the same way. He no longer glanced up when I walked into a room, and I stopped expecting him to. We became polite, instead of close, careful, instead of honest. Even the way we spoke changed, shorter sentences, fewer questions, conversations reduced to logistics instead of connection. Did you pick up groceries? What time will you be home? It was as if our marriage had quietly shifted from love to routine, without either of us signing off on it. And the scariest part, no one else noticed. From the outside, everything still looked fine. We were still living under the same roof, still functioning like a family, still showing up where we were supposed to. But inside it felt like living in a house that had already burned down. You just hadn't stepped outside to see the damage yet. Even our child seemed to sense it, before we admitted it ourselves, spending more time away avoiding the tension we pretended didn't exist. Children always know when something is breaking, even when adults refuse to say it out loud. Looking back, I realized the distance didn't happen overnight. It built over time, layer by layer, moment by moment, every time we chose silence instead of honesty, comfort instead of confrontation, avoidance instead of truth. And eventually, those small choices added up to something irreversible. We didn't fall out of love in one moment, we drifted out of it quietly, almost politely, until there was nothing left to hold on to. That's why when he finally said the words, "I don't think we make each other happy anymore," it didn't shock me. It landed softly, almost gently, because a part of me already knew. I just didn't want to admit it. Because admitting it meant accepting that something I believed in, something I invested years of my life into, had been slipping away right in front of me, and I had let it happen. If you've ever felt a relationship slowly go cold without knowing exactly why, then you understand how dangerous silence can be. And if you want to see how this quiet distance turned into something far more painful than I ever expected, tap follow now and stay with me for the next part. Because what came after this wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the beginning of the truth. You think a home falls apart all at once, but the truth is, it happens quietly, in ways that are almost invisible, until it's too late to fix anything. Our house used to feel alive, messy in the best way, full of noise. That meant something: laughter, echoing from the kitchen, unfinished, projects scattered across the table, the sound of footsteps rushing down the hallway because someone was late for school or work. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And somehow, without either of us noticing the exact moment, it changed. That life slowly drained out of it. The rooms stayed the same, the furniture didn't move, the pictures on the walls still showed smiling versions of us, but the feeling was gone. It felt staged, like a house prepared for strangers to walk through, not a place where a family actually lived. We still followed routines, but they felt mechanical, like we were performing roles instead of living them. Dinner became quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses against your chest and makes every small sound feel too loud. Sometimes we sat at the same table and barely spoke, both of us pretending there was nothing wrong, because acknowledging it would mean facing something we weren't ready to confront. Even the smallest interactions became strained. A simple question could turn into a short, clipped answer. Eye contact became rare. Smiles became polite instead of genuine. And the distance between us, though invisible, felt wider every day. But what hurt the most wasn't just what was happening between us, it was what was happening around us. Our child started spending more time away from home, staying longer at friends' houses, finding reasons not to be there. At first I told myself it was normal, just part of growing up. But deep down, I knew better. Children don't always understand what's wrong, but they feel it. They sense tension, like a shift in the air, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. And instead of asking questions, they adapt. They create distance of their own to protect themselves from something they can't control. That realization stayed with me longer than anything else, because it meant our silence wasn't just affecting us, it was shaping the environment our child had to live in. And still we said nothing. We moved around each other like careful strangers, avoiding conflict, avoiding honesty, avoiding the one conversation that might have forced everything into the open. It's strange how people can share the same space and still feel completely alone. We were under the same roof, living parallel lives, connected by responsibilities, but disconnected in every way that actually mattered. Looking back, I don't think the house became empty because love disappeared all at once. I think it became empty because we stopped feeding it. We stopped choosing each other in the small moments, the everyday interactions that quietly hold everything together. And without those, even the strongest relationships start to collapse. If you've ever walked through a place that should feel like home but doesn't anymore, then you know exactly how heavy that kind of silence can be. And if this part of the story feels familiar, take a second to like and subscribe, because what came next didn't just expose the cracks in our home, it revealed everything that had been hidden beneath them all along. Sometimes it only takes one sentence to destroy an entire reality, and for me it was a single text message glowing in the dark. I didn't go looking for it. I didn't suspect anything in that exact moment. In fact, just seconds before it appeared, I was still trying to understand why my husband had come back into my bed after months of distance, still trying to convince myself that maybe somehow this was grief, or closure, or the last fragile thread of something we once had. But then his phone lit up beside me so close, I couldn't ignore it, and the words appeared before he could hide them. Did she sign everything yet? That was it. No name at first. Just that cold transactional sentence. But it didn't feel like a question. It felt like a deadline, like someone waiting for confirmation that a deal had gone through. My chest tightened instantly. Not in anger, not yet. But in something colder. Something heavier. Like my entire body understood the truth before my mind could catch up. He reached for the phone too late. I had already seen it. And in that split second, everything changed. I turned my head slowly and looked at him, really looked at him, not as the man I had loved for years, but as someone I suddenly didn't recognize. His face didn't show guilt the way I expected. It showed panic. Not because he had done something wrong, but because he had been caught too early. That was the moment it all clicked into place. The timing of him coming into my room, the softness in his voice, the carefully chosen words. Just one last time. It wasn't love. It wasn't even nostalgia. It was strategy. He wasn't there to reconnect. He was there to make sure I signed those papers without questioning anything. And somehow that realization hurt more than any betrayal I could have imagined. Because it meant every small part of me. He once cared about my trust, my emotions, my lingering love had become tools he was willing to use against me. I repeated the message out loud, slowly, letting each word hang in the air between us. Did she sign everything yet? The silence that followed was louder than any argument we had ever had. He tried to explain, of course. They always do. He said it was work-related. He said it wasn't what I thought. He said it was complicated. But, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't confused. I wasn't second-guessing myself. I wasn't searching for excuses to make his behavior make sense. Because deep down, I already knew the truth wasn't going to sound better. It was only going to sound worse. And something inside me shifted in that moment. Something permanent. The version of me that still wanted to believe him disappeared. Replaced by someone who could finally see clearly. That one message didn't just reveal a secret. It exposed a pattern, a plan, a level of calculation I had refused to see before. And the most painful part, I realized this hadn't started that night. It had been building quietly, hidden beneath everyday moments I chose to ignore. If you were in my place, what would you have done in that exact moment? Would you confront him immediately, or stay silent and find the truth first? Comment 5 below and tell me, because what I chose next changed everything. The moment doubt enters your mind, it doesn't knock. It spreads quietly, relentlessly, until every memory starts to feel suspicious. After that message, I couldn't go back to the version of the story I had been telling myself. I had believed our divorce was simple, two people drifting apart, choosing peace over conflict, agreeing to walk away with dignity. But now that version felt naive. Because suddenly, every decision he had made over the past few months started to look intentional. Too intentional. The way he pushed for mediation instead of court, insisting it would be faster, easier, less stressful. The way he reassured me we didn't need to involve too many lawyers, that we could handle things like adults. At the time, I appreciated that. I thought it meant he respected me enough to keep things fair. Now it felt like something else entirely. Like he didn't want anyone looking too closely. I started replaying conversations in my head, picking apart details I had ignored before. The calm tone in his voice whenever finances came up. The way he dismissed my questions without making it obvious, subtle enough that I ended up doubting myself instead of him. And the biggest red flag I had overlooked, he never once encouraged me to review everything carefully. In fact, he did the opposite. He made it sound unnecessary, like questioning things would only complicate what was supposed to be a clean separation. That's when the thought hit me, sharp and unavoidable. What if the settlement wasn't fair at all? What if I was about to sign away something I didn't even know existed? My stomach tightened as that possibility settled in. Because if that was true, then this wasn't just about a failing marriage anymore. This was about deception. Deliberate, calculated deception. I couldn't ignore it, not after everything I had just seen. So for the first time in months, I stopped avoiding the uncomfortable truth and started asking real questions. I went back to the documents, the ones I had barely skimmed before, and looked at them with different eyes, not as a wife trying to end things peacefully, but as someone trying to understand what might be hidden beneath the surface. And the more I looked, the more things didn't add up. Small inconsistencies at first, numbers that seemed slightly off, accounts that felt vaguely described, details that were just unclear enough to avoid scrutiny. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would alarm someone who wasn't paying close attention. But now, I was paying attention. And once you start seeing patterns, it becomes impossible to unsee them. That was the moment I realized something critical: trust had made me passive, and passivity had made me vulnerable. I had been so focused on ending things without conflict that I never stopped to question whether I was being protected or positioned. And deep down, I knew the answer. This wasn't going to be simple anymore. Because the more I looked, the more I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever he was hiding, it was bigger than I had imagined. If you've ever ignored your instincts, and later realized they were trying to protect you, you know exactly how this feels. And if you want to see what I uncovered next, make sure to like and subscribe, because this is where the story stops being about doubt and starts becoming proof. I thought I was preparing myself for the truth, but nothing prepares you for the moment. Suspicion turns into undeniable proof. It started with a simple decision to stop guessing and start checking. After everything that had been building in my mind, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went back to the documents this time, not as someone trying to get through a divorce, but as someone trying to uncover what had been carefully hidden. At first, everything looked normal, organized, clean, almost reassuring. The kind of paperwork designed to make you feel like everything was transparent. But then I noticed something small. So small I might have missed it before. A reference to accounts that didn't appear anywhere else in the file. My chest tightened. I pulled out older tax returns from the storage box we kept in the hallway, spreading them across the table, comparing numbers line by line. And that's when the pattern revealed itself. Accounts that existed before were suddenly gone. Not closed, not explained. Just missing. The realization hit slowly, like cold water creeping up your spine. This wasn't a mistake. It couldn't be. There was too much money involved for it to be accidental. When I added everything together, my hands actually started shaking. Nearly $200,000 that had simply disappeared from the disclosures. I sat there frozen, staring at the numbers, trying to force my brain to come up with a reasonable explanation. A misunderstanding, a clerical error, anything. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Money doesn't just vanish. It gets moved, hidden, redirected. And if it's hidden, there's always a reason. That's when another detail surfaced, one I hadn't paid attention to before. A name attached to certain transactions. Vanessa. The same name from the message. My stomach dropped. Suddenly, this wasn't just about missing accounts anymore, it was about where they were going. And more importantly, who they were connected to. I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing, but my thoughts were moving too fast. Every late night he had worked. Every business trip that seemed to come out of nowhere. Every time he brushed off my questions with calm confidence. It all started aligning into something far more disturbing than I had imagined. This wasn't just financial dishonesty. This was a system. A deliberate structure designed to move money out of sight, out of reach, and out of the agreement I was about to sign. And the most painful part wasn't even the money. It was the realization that he believed I would never look closely enough to find it. That he had calculated my trust so precisely that he was willing to risk everything on it. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by papers that suddenly felt heavier than they should, understanding that the story I had been living in was no longer real. This wasn't a peaceful divorce. This was a controlled exit plan, and I was never supposed to see the full picture. But now I had. And once you see something like that, you can't pretend you didn't. If you were in my position and uncovered something this serious, would you confront him immediately, or stay silent and build your case first? Like and subscribe, because what I did next didn't just change the outcome, it changed the entire game. The most dangerous move you can make after discovering the truth is reacting too quickly and in that moment every instinct I had was screaming at me to confront him immediately. To demand answers, to throw every piece of evidence in his face, and watch him try to explain the unexplainable. But something held me back. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe it was the realization that if he had gone this far, then he wasn't just lying, he was planning. And if he was planning, then walking into a confrontation unprepared would only give him time to adjust, to deny, to cover whatever I hadn't found yet. So instead of reacting emotionally, I did something that felt completely unnatural. At the time, I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because for the first time I understood that silence could be power. The next morning, instead of going to work, I made a different decision. I gathered every document I could find: tax returns, bank statements, investment records, and I walked into a law office downtown with a folder that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. That's where I met Denise Holloway. She didn't look surprised when I started explaining the situation. If anything, her calm expression told me she had seen versions of this story before. That alone was both comforting and terrifying. After reviewing the documents in silence, she leaned back slightly and asked me one simple question: "How familiar are you with your husband's finances?" I gave a small, bitter smile. "Apparently not very." She nodded, not judging, just acknowledging a reality many people don't realize until it's too late. Then she pointed to the missing accounts and said something that changed the way I saw everything: "These don't disappear by accident." That sentence landed harder than any accusation could have, because it removed all doubt. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't poor communication. This was intentional. And once that truth was spoken out loud, everything became clearer. Denise didn't tell me to confront him. She didn't suggest dramatic action. Instead, she gave me something far more valuable: a strategy. "You do nothing impulsive," she said firmly. "No arguments, no accusations, no letting him know what you found." At first that felt impossible. Every part of me wanted to react, to release the pressure building inside my chest. But then she explained why. "Men who do this usually believe they're in control," she said. "And the moment they realize they're not, they become unpredictable." That changed everything. Because suddenly this wasn't just about truth anymore. It was about timing, about control, about making sure that when everything came out, it couldn't be denied or undone. For the first time since everything started unraveling, I didn't feel lost. I felt focused, not calm, not at peace, but clear. And clarity is a powerful thing when you've been living in confusion for too long. I walked out of that office with more than just legal advice. I walked out with a plan, and the most important part of that plan: pretend nothing had changed. If you've ever had to hide what you know just to protect yourself long enough to act, then you understand how difficult that is. Because what came next wasn't confrontation. It was preparation. I thought I had already uncovered the worst of it, but I was wrong. There's a point in every story where the truth stops being painful and becomes something else entirely, something heavier, something harder to even process. For me, that moment came with a single phone call. I was sitting in my car, parked outside a grocery store, trying to hold together what little composure I had left when Denise called. Her voice was different this time, more serious, more measured. "You need to sit down," she said, even though I already was. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew this wasn't going to be about missing accounts anymore. "What is it?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. There was a pause, just long enough to make everything worse. Then she said it: "The education fund." For a second, I didn't understand. Or maybe I didn't want to. That account wasn't just money, it was our child's future, something we had both agreed, without question, to protect, no matter what happened between us. "There's significantly less in it than there should be," she continued carefully. The words felt distant, like they were echoing from somewhere far away. "How much?" I managed to ask. Another pause. Then the number came, and everything inside me went completely still. Nearly $60,000, gone. I stared through the windshield as rain slowly began to fall, each drop blurring the world outside, while everything inside me sharpened into unbearable clarity. "Where did it go?" I whispered. I think I already knew the answer before she said it. Most of it was transferred into the same accounts connected to Vanessa. And just like that, any part of me that was still searching for a reasonable explanation disappeared. Affairs are one thing, financial deception is another. But taking money from your own child's future, that crosses into something else entirely. Something I couldn't justify, couldn't soften, couldn't even fully understand. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was a complete collapse of values. I sat there in silence, long after the call ended, gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my hands started to ache. All I could think about was how easily he had done it, how calmly he had gone about his life, knowing exactly what he was taking and where it was going, and the most painful part, our child still looked at him like he was everything, still trusted him completely. That realization hit harder than anything else, because it meant the damage wasn't just financial. It was emotional, foundational, something that would echo far beyond this moment. In that instant, something inside me changed again, not into anger, not even into sadness, into something colder, resolve. Because this wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. This was about protecting what he had been willing to risk without hesitation. And from that moment on, I knew there was no turning back. No more hesitation, no more benefit of the doubt. If you discovered something like this, something that crossed every line you thought would never be crossed, what would you do? Would you still try to understand, or would that be the moment everything ends for you? Comment your thoughts below, because what I decided next changed everything. You don't realize how powerful silence is until the moment you decide to break it, and for me that moment came in a room where everything was supposed to stay calm, controlled, and predictable. The mediation began exactly the way he expected. Neutral tones, polite exchanges, lawyers speaking in careful, measured language, as if they were discussing numbers instead of lives. From the outside, it probably looked like a respectful divorce. Two people handling things maturely, dividing assets, arranging custody, moving forward without unnecessary conflict. And that's exactly what he wanted. I could see it in the way he sat across from me, confident, composed occasionally, glancing in my direction, as if checking whether I looked overwhelmed enough to go along with everything. So I gave him what he expected. I stayed quiet. I kept my answers short. I let my lawyer do most of the talking. Because the truth is, real power doesn't come from reacting, it comes from knowing when to wait. For the first part of the meeting, everything followed his script. Property division schedules, agreements, all moving smoothly, almost too smoothly. Then the conversation shifted to financial disclosures, and that's when everything changed. My lawyer opened the folder slowly, deliberately placing documents on the table one by one. The sound of paper sliding across that polished surface felt louder than it should have. At first, no one reacted. Then his lawyer picked up the documents, and I watched the exact moment the confusion appeared. The slight pause, the tightening of his expression. "These accounts were not disclosed," my lawyer said calmly. Just one sentence. That's all it took. The room went still. He froze. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone outside would immediately notice. But I knew him well enough to see it. That tiny shift in his posture, the way his hand tightened, just slightly, the way his eyes moved too quickly, as he tried to process what was happening. For the first time, he wasn't in control. His lawyer looked at him, confusion turning into something sharper. Questions started coming, quick, precise, impossible to deflect without answers. And he didn't have them. Not the kind that could hold up under scrutiny. Because this wasn't something he expected to defend. He thought it would never be found. More documents followed, more accounts, more transfers. And then the name, Vanessa. You could feel the air in the room change when it was said out loud. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about intent, about where that money had gone and why. His composure cracked just enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath it: panic. Not regret, not guilt, panic. Because the plan had failed. Because the version of the story he had built was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just sat there, watching the truth do what it always does. When it's finally exposed, it speaks for itself. And in that moment I understood something I hadn't fully grasped. Before, the strongest position isn't the one where you react the loudest. It's the one where you're prepared, when everything finally comes to light. If you want to see how far this moment went and what happened after everything was revealed, make sure you subscribe, because this was only the beginning of the consequences he never saw coming. People think consequences arrive instantly, that the moment the truth is exposed, everything falls apart all at once. But real consequences don't explode. They unfold, slowly, quietly, in ways that strip everything away piece by piece. And that's exactly what happened to him. At first, nothing seemed to change on the surface. He still went to work, still wore the same tailored suits, still carried himself like a man who believed he could recover from anything. If you didn't know what had happened in that mediation room, you might have thought his life was continuing as usual. But underneath that calm exterior, the cracks had already begun to spread. It started with tension at work, questions that couldn't be easily dismissed, financial records that didn't quite align with internal reports. Companies don't like uncertainty, especially when it involves money, and once attention is drawn to something, it rarely goes away quietly. What he thought would remain hidden inside a divorce case began leaking into places he couldn't control. Reviews turned into investigations, conversations turned into scrutiny, and slowly the version of himself he had built, the reliable professional, the man in control, started to unravel. He didn't tell me directly when it happened. I heard about it through indirect conversations, fragments of information that made their way back to me. The kind of news people share carefully, pretending not to know how much you already understand. He lost his position, not in a dramatic public announcement, not with a clear explanation anyone could repeat, but in that quiet corporate way, where everything is framed as internal restructuring or policy concerns, the kind of language that hides the truth, while making the outcome undeniable. And just like that, the stability he had spent years constructing disappeared. Around the same time, the other part of his life began collapsing too. Because relationships built in secrecy don't always survive exposure. When everything was hidden, it probably felt exciting, untouchable, separate from reality. But once consequences started showing up, once pressure replaced illusion, that dynamic changed. I saw it the day I crossed paths with them again. There was no confidence left, no certainty, only tension, frustration, blame shifting in quiet, hurried conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. It made me realize something important: affairs don't just destroy one life. They create instability everywhere they touch, and once the truth surfaces, there's nowhere left to hide from it. Meanwhile, his world continued shrinking. The car he once drove disappeared. The house we shared was no longer his. The life he had carefully curated began reducing itself down to something smaller, less certain, less impressive than the image he had worked so hard to maintain. But what struck me the most wasn't the loss of status or money. It was the way everything seemed to catch up to him at once, not as punishment, but as consequence. Because in the end, nothing I did caused his downfall. I didn't need to. He built it himself, decision by decision, lie by lie, believing he could control the outcome. And that's the truth people don't always want to accept. Sometimes karma isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just reality, finally catching up. Everyone talks about the moment a relationship ends, but no one really talks about what comes after, when the silence finally belongs to you. For a long time, I thought the hardest part would be the betrayal, the confrontation, the collapse of everything I once believed in. But I was wrong. The hardest part was learning how to exist again, without constantly carrying the weight of someone else's choices. When everything was finalized, there was no dramatic ending, no final argument, no cinematic closure. Just signatures on paper, quiet confirmations, and a strange, almost unsettling stillness that followed. 14 years reduced to documents and legal language. And yet beneath that stillness there was something new, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Space. At first it felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. The house was quieter. The routines had changed. There were no more careful conversations, no more tension sitting just beneath the surface of everyday moments. It was just peaceful. And that peace took time to trust. Because when you've spent so long adjusting yourself to someone else's moods, someone else's expectations, you forget what it feels like to move freely in your own life. I started noticing small things first: mornings that didn't feel heavy, coffee that tasted different when I wasn't rushing or bracing myself for another difficult day,